Thank you for the introduction. Am I connected well enough to the microphone? And many thanks also for the generosity of Jose Luis and of Maria Jose in planning this workshop, inviting me, and it's already been really fascinating to hear all of the interventions so far. So thank you all. Sorry, this is an old-fashioned presentation. There's nothing for you to look at. So I'm just reading. So apologies in advance for that. So I begin. The questions that took me into the subject of today's paper were an increasing interest in how we can chart and analyze the place of gender in anti-heretical literature. And intertwined with that, how to think about the early modern culture around using these texts as encyclopedic reference books. Thinking about how early modern authorities use their reference books seems to me fundamentally also a series of questions about how we can understand such treatises and have both reflected and shaped a variety of worldviews. Knowing that these volumes were part of a dynamic and ongoing process of elaborating ideas in the life of each writer, and also across generations of readers, writers, and editors. To ground this reflection immediately in our key common source for this workshop, here are some of the ways I began to ask these questions of Alfonso de Castro's Educación. Of what I believe were originally around 129 of the lemma chapter headings indicating the categories of heresy to be expounded and refuted, I think 141 after the later 1550s revisions, but very few are categories as having a clear and absolute reference to gender. Only 3 of the lemma, the chapter intertitles, pertain very directly and specifically to women. One of them is, of course, Maria. There's no corollary view here, although there are multiple male roles or states of being: bishop, eunuch, pope, on the priesthood, on the monastic state, and a few entries are titled to refer to pivotally important figures of Christian theology. Not many big surprises here. Here for Castro, 2 women, the most central and unsurprising of choices: a chapter on Adam and Eve and a chapter on Virgin Mary. Yet notably more gendered male. Adam, of course, paired with Eve, but also Christ, God, the devil, John the Baptist, Judas, and a 6th entry to categories heretical error and its antidote. The Hebrew Bible king Melchizedek, not exactly of the same stature or commonplace use as the rest of the list. I began with a simple list to begin to gesture to the analytical question with which I'm really just still beginning to wrestle in this paper. I would say this is very much thinking still in progress of mine, about how to best systematically approach the question of the gender dimension of Catholic anti-heretical manuals. But first, I'm going to pause my consideration of the Adversus Omnes Hereses to explain some of the lenses that I bring to this question. Then I'll work with the De Iuste Redicorruptione, despite it being a bit out of order in Castro's career, before returning to the Adversus. I come to these questions as a historian who's examined the thought, careers, and writings, the social, cultural, and intellectual worlds of Spanish inquisitors. And this project emerges from the past few years of increasingly wondering about the ways in which the texts of inquisitorial theory deployed gendered rhetoric and reflected gendered ideas about heresy. As a surge of research accelerating over the past decade and a half or so, I'd say, has increasingly demonstrated, this workshop included, Catholicism in early modern Spain was in no way monolithic, and even the stances of elite ecclesiastics were marked by ongoing dispute, doubt, and evolution. I've been particularly committed to trying to think with an emphasis on social and cultural context. In Castro's case, thinking with a figure born the illegitimate child of Clare, profoundly shaped by early entrance into the Franciscan orbit, the university culture of both Alcalá de Henares and Salamanca, his formation and work as a theologian, his extensive and varied travels in Northern Europe and Italy, his life as a courtier in the orbit of first Charles V and then Philip II, and his participation in 2 delegations to the Council of Trent. Teaching and preaching were crucially and profoundly intertwined with his writings and pivotal to understanding his thought, as was the kind of deliberative work of councils and the kind of advising work of courtiers, and the politicking inherent to both, I would imagine, too. My interest in the dimension of gender in anti-heretical literature is also profoundly about contextualization. Since the 1990s, the question of women in particular, and of gender more broadly in the Spanish Inquisition, has been a key theme of research. While the majority of people tried, probably everyone in this room knows, were men, many scholars have explored many gender dimensions of the institution and its trials. Yet the theoretical literature, books like Castro's, have been still much less a focus of such. I've been interested in studying inquisitorial courts as variable, permeable human institutions, shaped by ideas, by institutional structures and procedures, and by webs of social dynamics. Inquisitors' encounters with women, as with many other identity markers we might select, were influenced by a complex of circulating discourses and representations from a whole range of sources, Catholic texts and practices, law, theater, and also by many relational experiences. A significant proportion of the tribunal's lesser staff were generally married men, and across their lifetimes, inquisitors, although clerics, of course, had a range of relationships with women with many different social identities, from close family members to those they investigated and put on trial. What I'm really still grappling with is how to organize this inquiry, how to analyze anti-heretical or inquisitorial legal theory with regard to its gender dimensions. Castro was, of course, himself not an inquisitor, but both his De Justa Hereticorum Punitione and his Adversus Unus Heresis were a key part of the Inquisition's theoretical framework, sources frequently cited and engaged within a universe of, I'd say, 20 or 30 or so key works of anti-heretical legal theory or explicitly inquisitorial legal theory, composed in Latin and that circulated in tandem with the growth of inquisitorial courts from the late 15th through approximately the middle of the 17th century. What I quickly saw as I delved into this question, and what did not surprise me, was that the specific form and volume of what I would see as explicitly gendered imagery varied significantly between different theorists. So I started out thinking through 4 primary ways to approach the extent and kind of gendering of these texts. As I said, I'll start first from Castro's De Justa Hereticorum Punitione, first published in 1547 in Salamanca, alongside the slightly later 16th century inquisitorial theory of Diego de Simancas, Luis de Paramo, and Juan de Rojas. And after those, I'll return to the Adversus. I started with the framing material, as I gestured at the start of this presentation, with the lemma from the Adversus. The index in the 1568 Android edition of the De Justa Hereticorum, for example, lists approximately 12 thematic topics out of just over 400 index entries that seem to me clearly to signal a concern with women, a clearly feminine subject noun, or a gendering feminine of the topic in some way. Half of those 12 entries actually turn out to refer to the same chapter on witches and whether or not witchcraft should be placed under their jurisdiction in heresy courts. Topics we covered this morning already. 2 of those headings from the chapter on witchcraft as heresy compare mulier to vir directly, as more lustful and more easy to deceive. The index of another mid-16th century edition of a manual of inquisitorial law could form a first basis for comparison, or sketching the contours of an approach. That lengthy treatise, a legal treatise, was the 1569 second edition. The first had appeared in 1552. The 1569 second edition, printed in Alcalá de Henares, of the Inquisitor and jurist Diego de Simancas' De Catholicis Institutionibus on Catholic Institutes, a substantial revision of his initial text, produced in the context of Simancas' role as Inquisitor in the lengthy heresy trial of the Archbishop of Toledo, Bartolomé Carranza, and shortly after the revocation of that trial to Rome. Simancas' manual was longer than Castro's and had a more detailed thematic index. The detailed topical index of the Simancas manual has 44 entries that reference various words for women, female figures, or obviously gendered terminology, out of slightly over 1,220 index entries. The quantitative dimension here is far from precise or even necessarily significant. But just to conceptualize these materials, that means that these are around 3% of the index entries in both treatises. In the Simancas volume, there is a notable emphasis on women as wives, especially in how women's property figures and the intricacies of confiscation of goods, and also in focusing on various marriage-related transgressions or dilemmas. The association between women and witchcraft again is clear in this index. Similar to the 2 index entries comparing Mulier and Vir and Castro, there is one in Simancas that women are to be forgiven more easily and punished more lightly in inquisitorial processes than men. There, however, the entry is not to a chapter on witchcraft jurisdiction as it had been in Castro, but rather instead to a chapter on the defense of accused criminals, reos. The indices in both Simancas' and Castro's late 1560s editions pointed to Pauline biblical texts to underpin a prohibition on women preaching and teaching, highlighted as among the failings in preaching that aided in sowing heresy. To expand that sense of both variability and common ground in this literature a bit further, another 16th century inquisitor and theorist, Juan de Rojas, had even less to say about women as a subject in his 2 inquisitorial manuals. first published in 1566 and 1572. In his alphabetically arranged treatise of 215 chapters, 3 are headed by María. Unlike in Castro or in Simancas, there is no chapter on or set of references directly to witchcraft. There's a brief reiteration of the claims that women are weaker and more easily deceived, but much of this is, as with Simancas, oriented around property, marriage, and confiscation. This presumed weakness makes women more at risk of losing their dowries for Rojas. And Rojas is concerned more by such questions as that marriage between a faithful Catholic and a heretic can be dissolved, or that a husband does not have to support a heretical wife in jail. One of the 3 quote-unquote women chapters, and Rojas very simply asserts, with no adjectives or qualifiers or additional conceptual baggage, that women can be accused in heresy cases and that women can be witnesses too. As I examined then some of these key inquisitorial treatises, or anti-heretical treatises, my first tactic was scouring the indices. My second approach was to follow those leads from the indices in tables and contents into the primary chapters which they indicated. As was a frequent argumentative tactic in his treatises, Castro's chapter in the De Usere Corruptione on whether witches should be considered heretics, which starts with definitions and etymology. Already in the second paragraph, witches as lamias is identified with mulier and rooted in the ancient text of Apuleius' golden ass. And then the next step associated to lust. A few pages later, Castro encapsulates a typical misogynistic theory, which we've covered in the last hours. He uses the first person, and this caught my eye, he uses the first person to interject 2 reasons why he believes there are many more women than men witches. First, Castro alleged that women were too credulous and then more easily deceived, and so more vulnerable to the devil's lies, a claim he immediately expanded then into a gloss on Eve as the first mother, seduced by the devil while Adam was not, and reading Paul's commentary in the 11th century Orthodox Bishop Theophilact's commentary on Paul. And an assertion that this was the reason women should not teach, that they should not mislead others. The second claim that women were more lustful and in that way also more vulnerable to the devil, Castro rooted in the New Testament as well via 1 Peter 3. To again offer a point of comparison and also sketch the persistent chains of influence and conversation across this literature, the Simancas Manual's chapter on witches covered some similar ground, again stressing this was a crime mostly committed by women and only rarely by men, and the chapter in Castro's manual was among the first references Simancas cited. Simancas made them a comparison between women and children, indicating a need for lighter punishment, along with a charge of greater female inclination towards anger and vindictiveness, but the direct and immediate link to Eve was absent for Simancas, the kind of variation across authorities that seems significant to me. These manuals recycled bits of material from chapter to chapter, as hinted here, and we ought also to imagine that the implications of their theory might be applied to other circumstances than only to use this to the specific consideration under which the author of a particular treatise filed it. Their use was mobile, I think, and not always fixed. Both Castro and Simancas raised suspicion of women's speech as a source of heresy, linking that also to their more generalized concerns that inept or heretical preaching was a key factor in the spread of heresy. Castro again repeated the Pauline prohibition from 1 Timothy, and the reasoning that Eve was seduced by the serpent, so women were more likely to be deceived by the devil and thus by dangerous preachers. The third approach I've taken with how to think through the gendered elements in this literature, and specifically with Castro's Manual of Inquisitorial Law, was to look for when and how particular figures, and especially biblical figures, appeared in anti-heretical texts. How were they constructed as exempla of varying kinds? How were certain figures envisioned as origins of particular kinds of transgression? Which were the most frequently invoked? In terms of biblical archetypes, Castro, as is already very apparent, centered Eve for casting suspicion on women generally. But as I've noted above, this was not the same across all inquisitorial texts. Simancas' 1569 treatise did not pursue the same strategy. The index of that edition, the one female figure other than Mary indexed by name, was the Hebrew Bible's Jezebel, an example he used to close his chapter on witnesses. There she became the impious paradigm for suborning false witness. Adam and Eve, to a lesser extent, were central to Luis de Parmo's 1598 fusion of Inquisition history and legal manual, but other figures surfaced there too, like making the biblical story of Susanna another kind of thought experiment. Rojas too invoked Susanna. A fourth and final method of approach that I've been thinking through is to begin to chart moments when Castro applied varying kinds of imagery we would think of as gendered female to male authorities. As I've written recently about, the De Jus Reformatione advanced one influential theologian's vision of Tridentine reform. There was a coherent intellectual and theological program that underpinned the work and linked it to Castro's other writings. In expounding what he believed had gone awry and what was in need of reform, he critiqued bad preachers, rejected discrimination against new Christians, and inveighed against women who preached in their houses, and in favor of solid preparation for the clergy. Castro also invoked a gendered imagery of maternal care in a particularly notable case, but as a metaphor for good exercise of male authority. He closed the whole work with a final page-long exhortation of the author to Christian princes, casting the book as his best attempt at offering a set of remedies for the grave threats menacing the church, ending with an appeal to secular authorities that bishops and other clerics could not hope for success without their support. And he intensified this appeal with an extended metaphor about the care rulers owed the Christian populace, taking as a point of departure the words of Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, "And kings shall be thy nursing fathers." He developed an image of the clergy as nourishing the populace with the milk of the Word of God, while secular princes must defend that care from the attacks of enemies of the faith. In a slightly different direction, in one of Castro's briefest chapters there, near the end of the first book of the De Jus Reformatione, on receiving repentant heretics mercifully back into the church, or as he termed them, heretical men who came to their senses, Castro began the chapter with a sequence of heavily gendered marriage and fidelity metaphors, articulated with reference to New Testament and Hebrew Bible texts, to illustrate the need to welcome those returning to the church, and use a soft hand with those whose errors stem from genuine ignorance. To offer one further example in this range or approach, Castro persistently defended the validity of the hierarchy of the church, even when its clerics had committed hidden errors. In such thinking, the sacraments and ecclesiastical jurisdiction were not to be compromised even in the face of inevitable human error. Thus, Castro drew on Thomas Aquinas and invited his readers to imagine if a priest was ordained who had never been baptized, and if that priest ultimately became the Pope, or to imagine if a woman who pretended to be a man were to be elected Pope. It's notable to reflect on the two limit cases, I think. Castro chose to emphasize to his readers the power and validity of the office of the papacy. Even in the face of hidden human transgression of a particular occupant, the unbaptized pretending to be baptized, a woman pretending to be a man. With the time that remains for me today, I'll move from Castro's De Jus Reformatione to his Adversus Omnes Heresias, taking these lines of approach to gauging the role of gender in that work, the work arguably at the heart of Castro's thought and lifetime projects of writing, teaching, and preaching, as well as the corpus of inquisitorial theory elaborated after it. First, taking a similar approach, as I did with the other texts, I began today's paper with a few quick observations about the subject index, the lemma at the center of this workshop, tilted noticeably more towards figures gendered masculine and feminine. And if he depicted the key categories of heresies circulating since the early church that way, it was even more noticeable with the approximately 200 entries of the names of infamous heretics and heretical movements. Virtually all men, or at least not highlighting women in these movements at the level of the volume index. The one that caught my eye as an uncharacteristic exception was the indexing of the late medieval movement of Vegas and Vegans, with the names together in both genders indexed to 7 different categories of heresies. Beatitudine, Poitu, Ecclesia, Unio, Obedientia, Operibus, Peccato, Unholiness, Sex, the Church, Fast, Obedience, and Sin. It might be too much of a leap to say, but one impression that these lists might have given, first the lemma of heresy headings, second the index of heretics, was that elaborating and promoting the many and varied heresies besetting the world since antiquity had mainly been the work, or perhaps better said, deeds or crimes of men. In some editions, there is also a fairly lengthy index of authoritative biblical texts cited in the Adversus. There are 2 scriptural citations with specific reference to women, women's roles, or female figures, again reflected in notably small proportion of entries, yet not, I think, insignificant, while yielding some interesting patterns. A handful of passages from the Hebrew Bible, that a man cleaved to his wife from Genesis, and Deuteronomy on the ill effects of 2 wives were deployed to argue against attacks on sacramental marriage. What was much more noticeable were various opinions about women pulled from the New Testament, around 15 evident in the list of authorities, and the particular prominence of Paul's letters there. As elsewhere, sometimes references to women were alleged as simply illustrative thought experiments of an entirely different point. For example, in the midst of the lengthy chapter on baptism and expounding the 10th heresy there, Castro reflected on the importance of a person's will and that there was divine knowledge of their will even when an act was not done. Among the examples he gave for that point, he referenced 5 Matthew 28, that whosoever shall look on a woman to lust after her hath already committed adultery in his heart. The most notable cluster of references to women in the scriptural proofs indexed was the Pauline letters. He went to Romans 7 for an image of fidelity, to Corinthians, the 1 Corinthians for an image of straying from God, being akin to seeking out a prostitute, again to evoke fidelity between husband and wife as a model. The key proof text for the contention that women were not to teach, one that I can always just feels laden with irony as I give such papers, but the women were not to teach. 1 Timothy 2 appeared, a proof text he would deploy also in the De Juridical-Political, as I mentioned already. Castro raised the former in his chapter on absolution to allege what he described as a, quote, repugnant belief of Luther that a woman could absolve, that any Christian, even a woman or a child, in a priest's absence could equally absolve. The line immediately following that in scriptural text, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, was also indexed as a key to the 6th heresy regarding Adam and Eve, a rather lengthy disputation of Castro's of what he presented as the heretical claim that Eve was not formed from Adam's rib. Castro emphasized there his opposition to a contrary opinion of the Dominican Tommaso de Vio Caetans in his commentary on Genesis is clearly against Scripture. Castro's own near contemporary, he made that reputation of Tommaso de Vio's reading of Genesis also a moment to return to his frequent contention that a person could be in error without themselves being necessarily a heretic. We might see many other commentaries embedded in this reflection. Threaded through the lemma on Adam and Eve, to my eye, is both a steady insistence on Adam's primacy and Eve's generation from out of his body, but also of honoring both as the source of the origins of humankind and divine creation, Eve as mother of nations. And there are fascinating asides, as when Castro expanded his opposition of Caetan's interpretations of Adam and Eve by stressing the point that this was not only the view of Christian authorities that he, Castro, held, but also of Jewish teachers, explaining how Josephus, who Castro described as very learned in Hebrew and Greek, described that God had seen Adam's need for companion as the animals already had, and so created Eve. These sections also summon one other route of analysis that I signaled earlier in my talk today, the many uses to which many early modern theorists might put specific biblical figures. The centrality of Eve with Adam and Mary was, of course, unsurprising, each with entries detailing heresies related to the understanding of them. Castro's chapter on Mary was relatively brief, principally concerned to assert her perpetual virginity and refute any heresies associated with that, intertwined with the chapter that he had written on heresies about Christ, and centered on the defense of Mary's honor, and so by extension, the supreme debasement of heretics and defaming her. One other biblical woman's name began an entry of those scriptural authorities in the 1565 edition, Martha. Indexed to the chapter on work, labor, Martha figures as part of a refutation of what Castro presents as the ancient heresies of the Massalians, an argument over the meaning of Christ's rebuke of Martha in Luke 10, and Castro's reassertion not just that monks were permitted to work, but that manual labor was good. Subjects, I think, meaningful also for him, that were highly charged in an era of contestation of monasticism tied to his own identity and life experiences as a Franciscan. Castro stressed the harm of idleness of the body, and that the correction of Martha was about choosing the appropriate act at the appropriate time, not to prepare food when she could learn a spiritual teaching from Christ himself. And biblical exempla were also threaded through the text without being announced in indices. The lemma on marriage, for example, references Rachel and Leah, Jacob's wives, in Castro's 4th marriage-related heresy, attacking Anabaptist polygamy through 2 quarreling biblical sisters, as a model of marriage disordered and without peace. Castro's treatment of his second marriage-related heresy takes other Hebrew Bible figures to offer positive examples of the validity of remarriage for those widowed, starting the list with Abraham first, then Ruth. Very occasionally, also, contemporary examples from Castro's own life experience appear. And here I'll thank adding just a sentence on this from a conversation with Victoria yesterday. Is in the chapter on marriage in the later versions, in Castro's treatment of the fifth heresy against dissolving marriages. He cites his observation of the allegedly positive effect of the marriage of Philip II and Mary on restoring English marriage, traces of his time as a courtier and preacher in England in Philip's entourage. Of course, a central place to examine questions of gender and the adversus is the quite short Lemma Familia. This entry provides a clear template for the kinds of material with which I began in Castro's De Historia. The core project of this subject heading, as this workshop suggested, selected lemmata from our organizers directed us to, grouping mulier with priesthood, with preaching, with sacramental orders, was a defense of the priesthood as the preserver of men, in response to the perceived Lutheran attack. The brief chapter is packed with stock misogyny, alleging women are too talkative and gossipy to hear confessions and keep secrets, too weak and easily deceived, lacking in prudence. Castro again threaded through Pauline epistles, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs, and referred to Theophlactus as he would do in the De Justa Redicorum Punitione. The chapter crescendoed to once again allege the example of Eve, here offering her as a paradigm or template for all women, all susceptible to seduction, and disqualified from the priesthood. Closely intertwined with this material, the lemma on preaching, of a similar line of defense of clerical authority, centers opposition to Luther, teaching that God's word can also belong to laymen and to women. Castro accuses Luther of extortion. He claims that to give women the power of teaching is to curry favor with them and so attract them to his camp. And he accuses Luther of deliberate, knowing distortion of Paul and allowing women space for religious speech in the absence of men. Stepping from Paul to Eve once more, Castro claimed that absence of men, to correct women, even increases risk of women's seduction, likened to Eve's when Adam was absent. Castro amplified the stakes further to spell out that Eve's teaching brought lasting suffering on humankind. Castro's depiction of women throughout the Adversus also served to underline a polemical image of heretics as predatory and manipulative. Is Luther here, what I just described, or where in the Lemma on Coitus foregrounds a vision of Anabaptist sexual compulsion of women? Well, indices of opinions and Castro's 1571 collected works centered these assertions in the entries for women from Moliere. There was also, at the same time, as I hope to suggest today, a wide range of ideas to which references to women or gendered imagery were attached. As men's and women's bodies, pregnancy, sex, and marriage were in many different ways recurrent subjects of debate about the continually shifting lines between heterodoxy and orthodoxy. And as such subjects were also continually combined and recombined with others to think and reason through complex theological topics by analogy. I'm still, as you can see, very much in the process of sorting out what to prioritize in this vast array of possibilities that could all be included in this survey, and what to make of it all. But when we think about questions of gender and heresy, we can certainly bring treatises like these into greater conversation with our study of the social worlds that produced them and that they in turn played a part in shaping. In the vein, I think of Stuart Clark's 1997 intellectual history, Thinking with Demons. I think it's certainly worth still considering when authorities like Castro chose women or gendered constructs as figures of thought and when they did not.